Our first session this morning is dealing with the obviously topical and thorny issue about Murray-Darling Basin policy choices and actions. And our first speaker in today's session is well known to many of you. Quentin Grafton was part of the Aares editorial team with Tom Compass and Jeff Bennett that really propelled our journal into the stratosphere in terms of impact factors and really set a high bar for the incoming editors who are very confident will maintain and continue the trend of the previous editors put in play. Quentin is Professor of Economics and Director of the Centre for Water Economics, Environment and Policy at the Crawford School of ANU. In 2010, he was appointed as Chair of the Water Economics and Transboundary Water Governance Committee of UNESCO and has spent a lot of his professional career working on issues related to the environment and economic approaches to formulating and implementing policies with respect to water. So I think Quentin is eminently qualified to speak to the topic, the economic, environmental and social sustainability in the Murray-Darling Basin community.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to this conference. It's a real pleasure, real honour to be here. Special thanks to the organisers who put me on for this morning. I do appreciate that. I'm a bit humbled by it, to say the least, given the number of people in the audience who I respect and who've written a great deal on the Murray-Darling Basin over many, many years. So the title I was more or less given was to look at the economic, the environment and the social issues associated with the Murray-Darling Basin. You probably say, well, I'm only qualified to talk about the economic side. I think we all have to go beyond our boundaries if we're going to try and resolve some of these diabolical policy issues. So I'm going beyond my boundaries, and I think we all have to. So let me see where I'm going to take for the next 30 minutes. I'm on for 30 minutes, and then Professor Alan Randall's on for the next 30 minutes, and Alan will be talking about various issues associated with sustainability. He's very qualified to talk about in relation to the basin. So where I'm coming from, it's an overview first of all, is I'm going to say where we've come from. I know a number of you here are well detailed in the history of where we've come from, but I think it's important for everybody to get us started with a point that's common to us all. Of course, state of the basin, the history of the reform process, and of course recent events. As Richard's comments told us this morning, there are issues that we ignore at our peril as economists if we don't take them into account. That's most certainly the case of recent events. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit about what's on the table. So there are certain policies that are currently on the table, and I think we need to look at them, and that's one of the things that we need to do as economists, and I'll give you some brief review of them. And then I don't know whether I'll answer the question, but I have an answer for it, but it's very much a series of questions. From the big question, can water reform achieve a sustainable Murray-Darling Basin? I think that is the case. However we define that's what we mean by sustainability. But there's a number of things that we have to go through to see whether that evidence backs that assertion. We have to talk about the cost, irrigated agriculture, community impacts, as Richard stressed. We have to measure environmental benefits, and we need to talk about dynamic trade-offs. Clearly, this reform process is about reallocating water in some form or other from different parts of the basin to different individuals to other purposes. That's a trade-off issue. That's what economists can help with. And then I'm going to end with some dot points about sustainability planning and actions, which is a bit beyond my boundary, but I have worked in those areas as well in terms of resilience, to give some suggestions of the sorts of things that we need to be thinking about. It's not a formula, it's simply a set of issues that we want to talk about, and I think we need to think about. So the first point I'm going to kick off is where we've come from. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the state of the basin. So the basin can change quite rapidly, as we know, in the last 18 months. So we were in the middle of the drought, the worst point of the drought in 2007, 2008. And that's not so long ago. Now we've got flooding in major parts of the basin, including the state here of Victoria. Things have changed around dramatically. Some people are suggesting that problem is over. I wish that were the case. I wish just simply rain falling onto the ground would solve all our problems. That's not the case. Part of these problems have been generated by people in terms of decisions they've made, so we have to resolve them in terms of the decisions we make today and into the future. It's not just about rainfall. I'll talk about the history of water reform, and then, as I said, look about the recent things. So what you have up here is just a map from the Bureau of Meteorology, which looks at what's happened in the last 10 years, at least up until the recent past. And you can see on that map where the basin is on the southeastern part of Australia, of course. You see those very red bits. Those very red bits at the end of the Murray-Darling Basin in terms of generating the flows for the environment and flows for irrigators and flows for the communities that need water. So it tells us that we're in an extreme situation over that period of time relative to the past. And that's why it's been called the Millennium Drought. The drought is now broken. We now have water in the southeastern part of the basin. We also have a lot of water up in the northern part of the basin. But that tells us where we've come from in the last 10 years. And understanding that, the rainfall issues, which generates those extreme trade-off issues, has generated a whole raft of water reform processes. That helps explain where we've come to in 2011. So what are the implications of the Millennium Drought? What are the implications of decisions we've made in terms of water allocation? They are two things that need to be put together. You can't have one without the other. So you can see that there are some peak flows that will come in at different times within the basin. If we take this to 2010, 2011, there's going to be another major peak. Something, I don't know how far it will go up relative to the 1970s, but it's certainly, compared to the previous 30 years, it's certainly bigger than any other peak. How big, we don't know at this stage. But the point of this is to simply say that we basically had no flows from the Murray Mouth from about November 2002 until very recently in terms of the end of 2010. So that's a fundamental change that happened over that period of time. That's the end of the system, of course, and of course that's the end of the system is likely to feel the biggest impact in the sense that we have lots of extractions throughout the basin. But there are impacts throughout environmental assets and wetlands, etc., throughout that period of time. Now, one thing I want to stress here, okay, just look down at the bottom here. Pre-development, no Murray Mouth flow 1% of the time. That's no Murray Mouth flow 1% of the time. That's based on long-term averages. With development, no Murray Mouth flow 40% of the time. That's based on the long-term 112 years of data. So that's not a climate change issue. That's not an issue just because of the Millennium Drought. That is an issue in terms of decisions that we've made as a society about how we allocate water. Okay, so it's not simply about rainfall or lack of it. It's also an issue about how we decide to allocate the rainfall that comes in inflows, that goes into storages, that goes into flows. Really a critical point. So how we allocate, of course, has a number of repercussions. It's not just volumes of flows, it's the timing of flows. So this is an example here, a golden broken, obviously for the state of Victoria. You can see the pre-development flow in the green line. You've got quite a different peak in terms of the flows, in terms of August and September. Now we look at the current flows, you've got peaks in the summer months, January and February. So there's changes in the timing of flows, as well as changes in the volume of flows. There's another example there, Ridgey at Rocket. And how does it all add up? Well, here's a diagram from CSIRO. And so you go to the very end of this. It's not a time diagram. It's all based on regions. So you go to the very end. The NBB stands for the Murray-Darling Basin. And you can look at two colours, blue and the green. And those represent the relative levels of surface water use for the Murray-Darling Basin at the very end. So the blue is the historical climate. So that's the long-term average we're looking at. And then the green is the median 2030 climate. So that's looking into the future. And there's good evidence to support at least the southern part of the basin will get drier. May not necessarily be the case for the northern part of the basin, but certainly the projections indicated for the southern part of the basin. And then you can see there's a judgment call there in terms of proportions. There's a quantitative measure and a judgment call in terms of high, or in this case, extremely high surface water use. So that's not about rainfall, it's not about the millennium drought. If you look at long-term averages, that's over droughts, it's over floods, it's over normal periods, And so we can see we made a decision to allocate a good proportion of that water for purposes other than environment, valuable purposes such as irrigation. And so these are just diagrams just indicating here where we're at, current water management, and where we're at in terms of potentially where we're at with the guide to the proposed basin plan, which is a reduction in terms of the sorts of use that we would have in terms of water diversions. I think it's useful just briefly talk about the history of water reform, where we've come from. We can go way back, well before 1994, but the COAG reforms in 94 were critically important. We're talking about a camp that was actually finalised in 97, though there was a temporary camp before that point. And then we can go to 2004, the National Water Initiative, and then we can go to 2007, 2008, the Water Act and the amendments to it. And then we're now in a situation of sort of this interperiod where we haven't got a basin plan yet. It's coming soon, and then the potential implementation of it. And as Richard pointed out, things get in the way when we start to make decisions in terms of just looking at the numbers. People get in the way, and as they should, when it comes to important decision making, they also want to be part of this decision making. That's led to the parliamentary inquiry, which will make its determinations in April of this year. So just to go through quickly about the National Water Initiative, just to get an idea that this has been up until very recently, hopefully it will continue, there's been a lot of bipartisan support for the reforms that have gone on in Australia. That's been at a bipartisan level in terms of our Commonwealth, the federal government. It's also been supported by state governments. They've signed on to this, state governments have signed on to it, as well as the different parties within the federal parliament. So if you go look at these paragraphs, they're just emphasising what governments signed on for. So they did sign on for environmentally sustainable levels of extraction. In fact, the National Water Initiative was an initiative of John Anderson, who's leader of the Nationals and in the coalition government, the previous federal government. And it was signed on to by a range of farmer groups as well, in terms of wanting to bring about a reform process that was also good for themselves, but also good for society as a whole. Whether we agreed substantial progress will be made by 2010, we can make a judgment call on that. Hopefully by 2012 that will be the case. Water Act 2007 was an indication by some people that the National Water Initiative wasn't going the way they wanted it to go in terms of either the speed or in terms of the actual actions and implementation. So the Water Act was about, in some sense, centralising the planning processes. And now again, it borrows from the National Water Initiative. It talks about the optimisation of the economic, social, and environmental outcomes, which is what I'm trying to talk to you about today.